So the second variable that we can use to our advantage to help us to start to shallow the club a little bit better in the downswing are the wrist angles that we carry on the lead side. So the lead side would mean essentially our lead hand, which is the left hand for a right-handed player. So for either dexterity, we're talking about the glove hand. Now, the two extremes of the wrist movements that we have would be extension or flexion. So extension would be when the knuckles of the hand are hinging well above the forearm, like this. That would be considered a cupped or extended position. So you'll commonly see this with golfers on tour like Webb Simpson or Patrick Reed. And the opposite would be flexion, which is essentially curling the knuckles of the hand underneath the forearm, like that. This would be a flat, flexed, bowed position, whatever term you want to use. That would be like a Dustin Johnson, obviously, or like a John Rahm. Now, those two wrist movements are going to manipulate the shaft angle very differently. They will also manipulate the club face very differently. So we have to be looking at more elements if we want to be able to use this to our advantage. So a common tendency we'll see with golfers who have very steep shaft angles in the downswing, so very upright, kind of out to in patterns, is a very cupped wrist. So something like this. So if I retain a lot of extension on the wrist angle, a lot of cupping to the wrist in the downswing, that typically will influence the shaft into a very upright position. So you can see that there. If I simply keep all the variables the same, and instead of keeping this wrist cupped in the downswing, it is into a flatter position like this, you are going to start to notice as I'm doing this, that the shaft is getting into a more shallow spot. So you have extension like this. Again, you can see the shaft angle get very upright. I am very cupped with the wrist, right? The knuckles of the hand are hinging well above the forearm. Or we have flexion. So if I curl the knuckles of the hand underneath, that typically will shallow the club. So it starts to get it into more of a laid-off position. You can see that there. So a golfer who is in a flatter spot to the wrist angles in the downswing, especially if they're using this variable to manipulate the shaft that way in the downswing, is going to start to shallow the shaft out. So you can see here I'm retaining a lot of flexion to the wrist. Now, in order for a golfer to be able to do this functionally, they need to first understand how the wrist angles are working with the grip. Not every golfer can do this. Some of them would hit it really poorly if they did this, and it's my job to clarify why that's the case. Now, if you have a very strong grip, okay, so a strong grip, I'm not talking about the grip pressure. I'm talking about the rotational positioning of the hands. A very strong grip for any golfer would be where the glove hand is very on top of the grip, so very in the fingers and very on top. You can see when I'm sitting up here, the logo of my glove is like directly on top of the handle. The line between the index finger and the thumb here would be pointing to my trail side, so to my right shoulder for me. The trail hand would be very underneath the grip like this. This would be an exaggeration of a very, very strong grip. Well, when I do this, I am presetting the wrist into a cupped position when the face angle is square in my setup on strong grips. So even if I am extended with the wrist angles at the top of my backswing here, you will see that the face angle is not open at the top. Right? It might even be a little bit closed if you're exaggerating to the extremity that I am right here. And so this golfer cannot functionally get the wrist to move into a flatter spot, even if it helps them with the shaft, because in the downswing, the face angle is going to get way too closed. Meaning, that golfer can either find an alternative method to shallow the club and keep the wrist angles where they are, very cupped with a strong grip, right? And they can learn to shallow the club through other means without necessarily needing to get the wrist angle flat. Or if they want to use the wrist angles to their advantage, to teach them how to shallow the club better, which is an option for sure, that golfer would need to change the wrist angles first into something that is not as strong. Meaning that golfer would have to weaken their grip into something either neutral or even a little weaker depending on the severity of where the club face is. Obviously, we can't necessarily say as an absolute, but if you need it to be weaker than that, it's going to have to be either neutral or weak, right? So the glove hand not so much in the fingers and not so much on top, a little more to the side of the grip on the lead side. You can see here it's a little more my palms, and my trail hand would be a little more on top of the grip, right? So this would be neutral, kind of even maybe a little bit weak. Well, that golfer now has the opportunity to be able to move the wrist into flexion to shallow the club without getting the face angle so shut in the downswing. You can see that there, right? Whereas before, when I had that really strong grip and I tried to flatten the wrist out, well, I could use the wrist moving into flexion to my advantage to shallow the club. You can see when I move the wrist into that flat position, the shaft pitches back behind me, but the face angle would get too close if my grip is strong. So weakening the grip all of a sudden allows me to move that wrist into flexion to help me shallow the club without the face getting too shut. So if you want to be able to use your wrist angles to your advantage, I'm totally okay with that, but you have to make sure you match it with the appropriate grip first, or else you might end up in trouble. You might end up shallowing the club well, but the face angle is no longer functional for your pattern. So just be aware that there's more elements to look at if you're using the wrist angle to your advantage.